That, okay.
Okay.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Tax Talk, broadcast by the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. My name is Jordan Bateman, and I am the British Columbia Director of the CTF, joined, as always, by our brilliant Alberta Director, Paige McPherson. Paige, how are you?
I'm doing fine, thanks, Jordan. I'm excited to try out this new format, just trying to figure out how we can see the questions on the side.
So Paige and I like talking to people, so we're excited that for the first time ever for the CTF, our Tax Talk podcast is going to be broadcast live through Facebook Live. So I imagine many of you will be watching this on Facebook. We're very much looking forward to your comments and to your questions throughout the next half hour or so, so please don't be shy. But just so you're aware, Paige and I are on a 10-second or so delay
Yeah.
because of the way Facebook is set up. It means we don't see your comments until a few moments after you post them, but we'll do our best to handle that time jump. I guess technically Paige and I are in the future, so if there's any big news in that 10 seconds, we will also pass that along. Any lottery numbers that we can pass along, we'll help you with that as well.
We're already in the future in Alberta, though, compared to BC, so.
That's right. Well, we can talk about the future in Alberta. The carbon tax came into effect January 1st. We have a prime minister who's announced he's going to phase out the oil sands while allowing billions of dollars to be spent on pipelines. Not sure how that squares, but we'll talk about all that and a lot more. So the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan advocacy organization dedicated to three things: lower taxes, less waste, and more government accountability. That's what drives all of the communications, research, and advocacy work we do. Lots of ways for you to connect with us. Obviously, you can leave a comment live here on Facebook. You can tweet us at Jordan Bateman or at Paige McP. You can visit our website at taxpayer.com to see what it is Paige and me and the whole CTF team are working on. And you can email, if you like the old-fashioned email, bc.director@taxpayer.com. And just so you know, a recording of this will be available as a free podcast in the iTunes store shortly after we finish up, if I've hit all the correct buttons. But you can search for Tax Talk and go from there. But first, on Tax Talk, we like to talk about what's new. Paige, anything catch your eye this week?
Yeah, so something that's new here in Alberta, as you know, it's budget season, one of our favorite seasons at the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. And the government here announced that they are going to be doing public consultations across the province, in different communities across the province. So I thought, awesome, our supporters are going to love this. They'd love to give their feedback on the budget. Contacted the government to find out a little bit more about, where these public consultations will be held, how people can sign up, because all of that had been sent out was a government press release basically saying this. And it said, okay, here's when we're going to be in Edmonton, here's when we're going to be in January, but didn't have any times or locations or anything like that, other than that sort of those vague details. So some journalists were thinking the same thing as I was, and journalists from multiple media outlets were saying, okay, great, where are these public consultations? We want to find out more. And it turned out that these public consultations weren't so public after all. They were by invite only from NDP MLAs, which they later amended to say, okay, maybe some other NDP or other MLAs in the riding, if they want to suggest a person, we'll consider them for the meeting. And I've spoken to a few other MLAs about this. I know at least one got one person into one of these meetings, so not a huge broad swath other than the invites from the NDP MLAs. But the other thing is that they're only taking place in NDP ridings. So these public consultations across the province are by invite only by NDP MLAs and only in NDP ridings, as if only NDP stakeholders would care about, what's happening with the budget or would have valuable feedback. And of course, only the budget affects those NDP ridings, right? So anyway, those are going on through the province now. The only genuinely public part is that there's going to be there's a sort of open form letter where you can type a paragraph of your thoughts, send them to the government on the budget. And then there's some town halls, 2 telephone town halls that they're going to be hosting, one for Southern Alberta, one for Northern Alberta. But of course, if you wanted to attend one of these meetings, it would probably be a lot better if they had these multiple meetings for the public. You get, that FaceTime that now, of course, you only get if you were invited by an NDP MLA in most cases, and you live in an NDP riding in most of these cases. Instead, you kind of just have to hope that your question gets on the queue in a telephone town hall. But anyway, I'm not sure why the government went through the song and dance of announcing that these were public and across the province. If, they could have probably just said, we're going to a few select ridings, it wouldn't have been such a big deal. But there you have it, our open, accountable government in Alberta, genuinely caring what we think about the budget.
Okay, so hold on. So in British Columbia, we have a Standing Committee on Finance and Government Services. They do the pre-budget consultations. Anyone can apply. And I've never heard of anyone being turned down. I've presented at it multiple years consecutively. Heck, even if you show up and you don't have an appointment, they generally try to fit you in at the end. You're telling me that in Alberta, you got to know an NDP MLA, you pretty much got to live in an NDP riding, and you've got to somehow wiener your way into that invite-only group?
Exactly, and it was only after that pushback from media and from groups like ours that the government kind of opened it up to say, okay, maybe if there's a Wild Rose MLA in a community that's close by, they can sort of invite some people too if they want. And it's funny because they sort of presented it. It was originally sort of public and community leaders, which later turned out to be okay. If it's only invite only, it's probably more like a stakeholder session. But we weren't invited. And I mean, traditionally, the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, we've been present, active in Alberta for over 25 years. And only twice have we not ever gone to budget consultations in those 25 years or 26 years now. And that's one was under this government. It was last budget under the NDP government here. And so I think that's concerning. Like, they didn't invite us as a stakeholder. They also didn't invite the Canadian Federation of Independent Business as a stakeholder. And invite whatever stakeholders you would like. But I just don't know politically. Why don't you invite groups that maybe have a dissenting opinion? It's probably good for your own sort of public relations as a government. And in an ideal world, you'd want that feedback. You'd benefit from getting that kind of feedback. So it's not exactly a broad swath, I think, of the population that's been invited to these, including stakeholder groups.
I think it was our former Alberta director, Derek Fildbrand, obviously now a Wild Rose critic, who once was uninvited to a budget session in Alberta and threatened to crawl in through a bathroom window to get there. So the Wild Rose MLAs, any of them going to crawl through chimneys or wear masks to sneak in, fake IDs?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm as agile as Derek. I don't know if, scaling a wall would be my strong suit as it would be his, unfortunately. But that's the one other time that we didn't, that we weren't, I think, initially invited. So it's pretty crazy. But anyway, it makes for another fun story about this government. So what's new with you in BC?
Well, Paige, we have survived the great Icecouver crisis. It was a hashtag Icecouver that trended for a while after about a month of snow and frigid temperatures. And this is going to shock you, Paige, up to -8 we got in Vancouver.
We all feel so bad for you. So bad.
Well, let me tell you, it was almost like it was like an episode of the Game of Thrones out here. We had White Walkers swarming free salt pile giveaways at the fire hall. We had people crying, falling, just mass chaos. The entire economy essentially shut down for a couple of days because we couldn't possibly get through all this snow and ice. It really was an embarrassing time to be a Vancouver resident because we should be better than this. So to give you an example, and those of you who live in colder climates will find this quite amusing. At one point, Vancouver City Hall dumped huge piles of sand at every single fire hall in the city so that people could bring buckets and pick up some free sand and salt and salt and sand their sidewalks and their pathways. Well, there's this great video from one reporter, and it's like the dump truck pulls away and there's this long, polite lineup of people with their little buckets waiting in line, and all of a sudden the truck leaves and these people swarm this thing like walkers on The Walking Dead, on some poor soul. They were all over this pile. It was gone in seconds, shouting. Really sort of a sad moment for Vancouver. It kind of left people wondering, like, what would happen in a real emergency if you're counting on government to take care of you? That's probably not a great plan. So a lot of people now double checking their earthquake kits and wanting to make sure that they can take care of themselves.
Yeah, our friend Ada Slavinsky, who lives in Vancouver, she wrote an interesting article about what the salt crisis can teach us about socialism. Just that, sometimes relying on the government in these situations is really not the best bet, doesn't really pan out as well for the people. And you should, be prepared in your own way. But I do think it's funny. Like, I remember living in Vancouver, and the one day that it snowed, I think when I lived there, the buses like couldn't run, they couldn't get up the hills. It was the tiniest little dusting of snow. Nobody knew how to drive, including the public transit. It was just a disaster. Like people were sliding down hills. At intersections. It was quite funny for me. I wasn't driving, so I guess it was, I could sort of laugh from the outside. But also as somebody who lives in a province now where we were just recently experiencing, minus 50 weather, it's hard to have too much sympathy for you guys.
Yeah, it was embarrassing. I called Todd McKay, our prairie director. He lives in Moose Jaw. And I almost thought I'd killed him at one point. He was laughing so hard that he dropped the phone. So, yeah, not our proudest moment as a civilization here on the West Coast, but we'll do better next time, Canada, we promise.
Yeah, I'm sure you always say that.
Well, Paige, let's start talking carbon tax. I know Alberta came in on January 1st, and of course, British Columbia, we've had this since 2008. But let's start with a comment from Jen K on our Facebook page. Jen writes, with these carbon taxes in place, how or when will we know they're working? At what point can we say, hey, our tax dollars are reducing our carbon dioxide emissions, we're saved? And when that time comes, will we actually see a difference in our quality of living? I can tell you that it's been 7 years of carbon taxes in British Columbia. That moment has not come for us. And in fact, from the moment they brought in the carbon tax, all we've heard about from the people who've long pushed for a carbon tax was the need for it to be tripled, quadrupled, quintupled in order to make a real difference for the climate. So if you're waiting for that, Jen, don't hold your breath because you might expire in the meantime. But Paige, how is the first couple weeks of carbon tax going in Alberta?
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, so in terms of how it's going right now, people are just starting to feel the effects. You're starting to see businesses put, line items on receipts telling people why their costs have gone up, which in a lot of cases I think is a good idea. Like it's more transparent of the businesses because we know that in many cases the carbon tax is really a hidden tax. So you don't see it as a line item on your receipts like you might see it, the PST, which obviously we don't have in Alberta, but you might, see that as a line item. It's not like that with the carbon tax. It's really built into the price. So businesses, particularly trucking companies, transport companies, have started to say, this is why your costs have gone up to their sort of companies that they distribute to. And, you can then inform your consumers if you'd like as well. So we're starting to see that kind of stuff happen. People are adjusting to the carbon tax, but a lot of people have concerns. So I'm working on our pre-budget submission to government. We're still going to send one in, even if we don't get into one of these meetings. And we surveyed our supporters in Alberta, had a massive response to this survey and asked, are you concerned about the carbon tax? And over 90% of our supporters said that they are concerned. Quite most of them saying that they're very concerned about the impacts of the carbon tax on their family and or their business. So I think there's a lot of uncertainty and concerns right now. And I think that Jen's question is really good about how do we know that they're working? And funny enough, if you follow Alberta politics, Sandra Jansen, who used to be a PC MLA, sort of was running for leader at some point at the PC party, ended up dropping out of the race and then crossed the floor over to the NDP. While she was still on the PC side, proposed a really excellent amendment to the carbon tax bill, this climate leadership plan, or climate leadership act rather, saying let's have economic impact assessments after these taxes are imposed. So let's check in after a year, maybe let's check in after 2 years, just, to make sure that they're actually working, make sure that these taxes, we're getting our money's worth. And the NDP government shot that bill down. So since she's crossed the floor, Sandra Jansen has no longer continued pushing for this, which is funny. I've sort of encouraged her on Twitter to say, hey, you're on the government side. This is the perfect time for you to be pushing this. This is when you actually probably would have more influence. But the government has still said no to this. So there's actually no check to see, what the economic impact assessment is. Is there some sort of legislative check on whether we're reducing our emissions or whether we're improving the environment? No, there's nothing like that in Alberta. There's really nothing to see if the carbon tax is working. So don't know what the government's going to do on this front, but it's going to be up to independent groups like ours and really I think a lot of think tanks across Canada that are active in Alberta to do those kinds of checks and just see, is this carbon tax worth all of the pain? Because we know that in BC, we've basically seen no gain from the carbon tax and just pain.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Roger Jokey has a comment on our page saying carbon tax is ridiculous, totally destructive. It was and is a total money-making, controlling scam. Never had anything whatsoever to do with the weather. Hard to argue with that when you look at British Columbia's experience, where greenhouse gas emissions are up since the introduction of the carbon tax. We're now at about $30 a ton. So for those of you who kind of want to calculate that, it's about 6.5 cents per liter on gasoline. Oftentimes, your carbon tax is more than your natural gas bill, your carbon tax on your natural gas bill. So definitely costs to families. And you're right, very little gain. One of the frustrating things for us was that, we'd started to, I think, whittle away at the myth of the carbon tax, us and a number of other groups, including some, prominent public sector unions, some environmental groups, although they were using it as justification to triple the carbon tax. They wanted $100 per ton, which would be a 20-cent per liter carbon tax on gasoline. But we were all kind of saying, look, this isn't really working that well. And then out of the blue, this frankly kind of fake group, the Sustainable Prosperity people out of Ottawa, started writing reports saying, no, the carbon tax in BC is wonderful and the economy hasn't suffered and greenhouse gas emissions are down and gasoline sales are down, none of which was true. Like you can actually, we're all arguing against it. And, the only time carbon emissions dipped was during the Great Recession of 08 and 09. And even the environment minister at the time, the person charged with defending the carbon tax here in BC, pinned 2/3 of that on the economic downturn, said that, there's really very little credit you can give the carbon tax for those greenhouse gas emission reductions. So all that to say is, the jury is very much still out on any kind of evidence that the carbon taxes work to accomplish the goal that these folks want to accomplish, which is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And there's certainly evidence in British Columbia that it doesn't work as well as it's claimed out of Ottawa. And frankly, I'm kind of looking forward to seeing Alberta and Ontario's experience, because I bet you they're going to be a lot more like British Columbia's than like what the eggheads in Ottawa want to pretend it is.
Yeah, I would agree. So we have another comment from Marzena saying that I have a feeling there's not enough emphasizing that the carbon tax means taxing the necessities. So a lot of people who struggle already will be pushed into poverty, which again, I think is a really good point. And let's talk about
Oh, I think I lost Paige there. She was just about to go on a run too. Sorry about that, folks. She'll log back in a second. But yeah, let's talk about the energy poverty issue here. We saw that woman in the Justin Trudeau town hall meeting in Peterborough last week kind of talk about this issue, about how her hydro bills were higher than her mortgage, more expensive than her mortgage, and just how damaging and frightening that is. Certainly, this is not the first person we've heard it from. We've seen this again and again across the country. And two words that I think are going to become very important in future years here are energy poverty. Christine Van Guy's doing a lot of work on this already in Ontario. And as people end up paying more and more for energy, you're right, they have to make choices between other necessities of life. Paige, you're back.
Yes, I'm back. I don't know what happened there. This is the beauty of testing this out for the first time. So I don't know at what point I cut off there. I just sort of continued talking for a little bit. But I was saying that so in BC, it came with these tax cuts. That's what the carbon tax came with. In Alberta, the carbon tax comes along with these rebates. And a lot of those rebates are targeted at, lower income individuals. So people who make under $47,500 are going to get a so-called full rebate. But as far as we can see, that doesn't actually cover all of the indirect costs associated with the carbon tax. It doesn't cover the fact that other taxes will rise because of the carbon tax to pay for healthcare. Hospitals are going to cost more to operate. Schools are going to cost more to run. City buses are going to cost more to run, and the like. So it doesn't cover all of those costs. But, the government can make the argument that they have sort of mitigated the impacts on lower income people. But when you look at the other ways that it's going to to impact low-income people, the fact that, food bank usage in Calgary, as an example, because of the skyrocketing unemployment rates, are at a record high, and the food banks are going to have to be paying tens of thousands of dollars more in operating costs because of the carbon tax. Look at the fact that transit is going to go up. The government has said that they might put some money from the carbon tax into transit, but we don't know how much. Transit fares, as our mayor in Calgary has said, are going to go up as a result of this. So there are other ways that the carbon tax is going to increase costs for lower income people, even though they're getting some of those direct costs, like their home heating bill, maybe offset by some of the government rebates. So I think it's a real challenge, and we're not going to know exactly how the impacts are going to play out until, we're living it now. So now, we're part of this little petri dish, this experiment of the government. But you're right. It's taxing the necessities of life for a lot of people. Certainly don't think that if you could make the argument that if you're making, $54,000 a year, that you are, somebody who's so wealthy that they're not going to feel the impacts of the carbon tax. But in Alberta, you're not going to get a rebate, and your costs of life are going to go up, the necessities of life. So it's certainly a big challenge, and I think that it's a challenge that the government's going to have to wear when people start realizing that the rebates don't account for a lot of the costs of the carbon tax that are on those necessities of life for so many people.
Yeah, and even in British Columbia, where you have the government touting their revenue neutrality so much, it's still a net loss to most members of the public. A couple $100 a year that you spend in carbon tax that you wouldn't have to if it didn't exist. Nadine Lewis makes a good point here on the Facebook page. Let's just admit that the carbon tax is just a provincial sales tax in disguise. We can now say we are taxed in every area of our life: air, water, food, housing, and heat. Nadine, you missed one. You're actually being taxed on taxes too. The carbon tax at the pump, you end up paying the GST on top of that. So you're actually, not only are you being taxed in every area of your life of the necessities, you're even being taxed on tax.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And while the carbon tax isn't structured exactly the same as a PST, it is a consumption tax. So it is that tax on a lot of goods that you're going to have to purchase and consume. And the thing is that, a lot of things aren't exempt from the carbon tax, actually, how they're exempt from the PST. Groceries will cost more to transport from point A to point B, and so the cost of groceries will go up. But many groceries are exempt from the provincial sales tax, in other provinces. Well, they're not going to be exempt from the carbon tax because it's that hidden built-in cost. So it's a tricky tax, and I can certainly see why people do make that comparison. I'm loving this format, by the way. I love that we can just live chat with people on our Facebook.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the things I appreciate about what some Alberta businesses are doing is they're actually breaking out the carbon tax and adding it to the bill.
Yeah.
That is something we don't do a lot of in British Columbia. For example, you don't see it on your gas receipts in British Columbia. You don't see it. Really, the only place you see it is on your hydro or your natural gas bill. To me, that is a major point of accountability, and I appreciate these businesses in Alberta trying to show people precisely what this Notley Trudeau tax means for them.
Oh, sorry, I had a little glitch again there. So we have another carbon tax. Hans asking why are we focusing on the carbon tax given that taxes are a fact of life? Why aren't we focusing on more harmful taxes like payroll and income taxes? And I guess the answer would be that we are still focusing on income taxes and payroll taxes. The problem with the carbon tax for me is that it's a new tax avenue that governments can sort of play off as being, benevolent and great, and future governments can increase and increase and increase, and you're introducing yet another tax avenue. So even if the government, let's say that, in the case of BC, in the case of revenue neutrality, the government cuts a little bit from the general business tax, cuts a little bit from the income tax, and then increases the carbon tax. Well, let's say a different government gets in the next time. They can jack up that income tax, jack up that business tax, undo all of those good tax cuts, and then they can further increase the carbon tax because they've got this new tax avenue that gives some voters those warm and fuzzies. So it doesn't seem like such a bad thing to increase, or at least it gives them some political points where maybe increasing income taxes wouldn't. So I wouldn't say that, we're not focusing on those more harmful taxes, or I guess as economists would say, economically distortionary taxes like business taxes and income taxes. In Alberta, we're still definitely a big part of the fight to bring back that single rate income tax, better known as the flat tax in Alberta, that the NDP government got rid of and that the PCs would have gotten rid of as well had they won. So we're still fighting that battle. But I do think that the carbon tax, for a lot of our supporters, feels like a really unfair tax on the necessities of life. And again, I think just having that new tax avenue there, in my opinion, we should try to, slash it, get rid of that tax avenue now so that future governments can't increase it later. And then, keep our focus on the other taxes, but be able to reduce those taxes after we've gotten rid of this, the carbon tax. It's like a lot of people give me the argument, well, what if the government dramatically slashed income taxes, but introduced the carbon tax? And I say, well, let me know. The Alberta government's not doing that at all. It's, the complete opposite of that. They've increased income taxes and business taxes. But also, if they were to get rid of one of those tax avenues, then we could have a real conversation like that. But when you're introducing another one, I think it just gives future governments more power to just increase and increase and increase multiple taxes.
Yeah, and then what happens if as technology improves and greenhouse gas emissions go away? All of a sudden they'll be right back in your pocket for income taxes. It's not like government's going to get less expensive. So, we fight all sorts of taxes, including Hans. You're right. There are many bad taxes to choose from. This is one of them. You may disagree with that, but we believe it's an unfair tax, and frankly, I believe it's a redundant tax. I mean, in the Lower Mainland of British Columbia, we pay 50 cents per liter of taxes on gasoline. I fight all those different gas taxes, not just the 7 cents of it that is the carbon tax. These are things that drive up costs, not just in your direct tax bill, but again, underpins so many other different taxes that happen.
Mm-hmm. Good question, though. Fair question.
Yeah, and fair question. And look, not everyone's going to agree with every fight we have, and that's just, kind of the way it goes. And that's how it happens at the Taxpayers Federation. One of the taxes that actually I think Paige and I talk about a lot more than maybe some of our colleagues across the country is property taxes, and that's another one where big issue in British Columbia with rising assessments and frankly incredibly wasteful city halls, and a lot of that kind of ties back to the carbon tax as well, where it's increased some costs for municipalities and where municipalities are being pressured to do more quote unquote green initiatives, which always seem to end up costing us more money. So definitely lots of space to go on various taxes.
Mm-hmm. And I would say that, from our supporters, we're also an organization, that we're a supporter-based organization. We've got over 90,000 supporters across the country, and they determine a lot of what's, on our agenda. And the carbon tax is an extremely unpopular tax as far as our supporters are concerned. Like I mentioned, I just surveyed our Alberta supporters. One of the questions as well that I asked was, if you could eliminate one tax in Alberta, what would it be? And over 50% said the carbon tax. So it is a priority for our supporters who do think it's an unfair tax. But I would say that actually it's funny that you say property taxes, because I'd say probably the second largest tax, or the one that I hear about the next most after the carbon tax, is property taxes. Is people just can't understand why they keep going up. It's definitely a big issue in Calgary here, where our mayor froze property taxes, sort of. They increased them by 1.5% and then dipped into their fiscal reserves to pay for it. But it's all based on your assessment. So there's tons and tons of Calgarians whose property values went down, and yet they're paying more in property taxes, even though the government froze property taxes. So it's a convoluted and a lot of people think of quite an unfair tax system, especially for a lot of people on fixed incomes that can't afford it. So that's definitely another big issue here as well.
Yeah, and one more point on the carbon tax. I mean, we're facing, today's Wednesday, 48 hours from now, President Trump will be sworn in the United States. This is a guy who's, said flat out there'll never be a carbon tax on his watch. Paul Ryan and the GOP platform for both houses said there'll be no carbon taxes. And, Trump plans to slash business and income taxes, tax rates in the States. So this is a competitiveness problem. It's already one that we see in British Columbia, where we've lost business to Washington State. Washington State voters, by the way, voted down a carbon tax in the last plebiscite, in the last cycle of elections in November. So we need to stay competitive with America, because they are our number one trading partner. They're also our number one economic competitor. That's why, again, we need to talk about carbon tax and fight with it. And 75%, 80% of Saskatchewan residents, according to the latest polling there, oppose carbon taxes. And God bless Brad Wall for standing up for his folks.
Yeah. Yeah, almost 70% of Albertans oppose the carbon tax here as well, and we're still barreling forward with it. So there's a comment from Mitch saying it's nice to see millennials talking about that. That demographic doesn't listen to the old guys talking common sense. Not that we did at that age either, but they can see that it is safe to have a debate. No need to be triggered. Yeah, so that speaks to some of the nonsense that's going on Canadian university campuses with safe spaces and trigger warnings and all that ridiculous stuff. And I think it's a good time for us to give a quick plug to our student movement, because I can say that even we were totally blown away by the amount of millennials or the amount of people on university and college campuses that did want to talk about fiscal responsibility. They do want to talk about the debt that governments are leaving to their generations to pay off, which means, reduced services, higher taxes for them down the line. Our Generation Screwed movement, which is our student outreach wing of the CTF, is now on, what is it, Jordan, 27 or 28 campuses. I think they started out with a goal to get on 5 campuses or something like that. So just absolutely blew our own expectations out of the water by how much of an interest there was in this kind of movement. And, it's not been that long since I was at a university campus. And as a sort of a student activist. And I think that what this really shows is that if you give people this forum and, you start these clubs, all it takes is one person, and then this sort of, some people say silent majority, but at least some people on campus will kind of come out of the woodwork and say, yes, thank you for saying this. This is exactly what I believe. So I don't think university campuses are to be worried about perhaps as much as some people think, because there are lots of people who do care about these issues, even from a young age, and the rest of them will start paying taxes soon anyway, and then they'll come around.
I think Mitch Smith was complimenting us. I think he was calling us millennials. I'm far too old to be a millennial, by the way. I'm a Gen Xer. So.
I am. I'm not 100% sure what is a millennial, but I'm pretty sure I fit in there. But even looking younger than that, it's amazing to see our student movement.
Absolutely. Okay. All right. Well,
should we answer this last question here?
Yeah, let's do that, and then we'll go from there.
From Adam, he's a friend in Calgary. Why do people keep electing politicians like Nenshi, Notley, and Trudeau when they know taxes are an inevitable consequence? Increased taxing is one issue we can almost universally say people dislike, but people don't vote accordingly. That is a question that I cannot answer. I think it's really, I find it kind of depressing that both Trudeau and Notley ran on platforms of deficits in particular. Shifting, basically spending on what they want today, shifting the burden to pay for it off to tomorrow. And there are multiple political factors, I think, that go on in each election. People were probably tired of Harper. I think people in Alberta were very clearly tired of the PCs. So I hope that the election of these politicians was not an endorsement of deficits or an endorsement of tax hikes, but rather being tired of the out with the old, in with the new. But you might have a more sophisticated analysis of that, Jordan.
Yeah, well, I think people rarely vote in governments; they vote out governments. Mm-hmm. And you look through our history, and every prime minister that wins an election seems to be a reaction to the one before it. And certainly, Trudeau is very different than Harper, not just in policy, but in personality, in social media activism, in prettiness, in being able to engage with the public. Very different than Stephen Harper. One suspects the next prime minister will be completely different from Justin Trudeau. And you see that provincially as well. I mean, could you get more different from Jim Prentice than Rachel Notley? I'm not sure you could. So these are the things that happen, that you vote in reaction to the last person. And more, I think the Trump election being a big sign of this, more and more, I think the policy planks, the platform, are almost irrelevant to the personality, to the feel of the candidate for a lot of people. And it's more about the principles that person brings to the office and how they'll deal with all sorts of the radical change that goes on in the world, or the challenges that will face provinces or cities or countries. That to me is where politics is headed. I'm not sure that's good, but it seems to me that's where we're going.
Mm-hmm. So somebody else, Susan, comments about, interest. We're ignoring interest. We completely agree with you. The Alberta government is now spending over $1 billion a year just to pay interest payments on the debt. So that's something that you can know that we're pushing here as well. This is an awesome format. I'm really liking it. I wish we could answer all of these comments.
Right. That's right. But why don't we do now our usual feature, my favorite part, the waste of the week. So I have a good one here. Over the past few years, it's become typical for custom-made signs to grace podiums at BC government news conferences. It's a way for the government to reinforce the key message that they want to send at the event, and it usually includes a Twitter hashtag too. So my friend, the investigative reporter Bob Mackin, he used a Freedom of Information request to find out how much these news conference podium signs cost. And I gotta say, Mackin's brilliant on this stuff. I would never in a million years think to ask what that signage costs. Well, the BC Liberal government spent $32,000 over 3 years on podium signs, just podium signs. 42 of those boards cost taxpayers at least $100 a piece. And we're seeing this become more and more popular. Government spent less than $6,000 in 2013 on these things, spent $12,600 last year. These are the kind of things that happen when you have a government that's trying to get reelected and they're busy getting their message across. So that is our waste of the week.
That's yeah, that's some waste for sure. That's funny. It was quite controversial here when the Alberta government, well, under Redford, Derek, my predecessor, raised this as an issue of those signs on the road, those sort of building Alberta signs that had the same colors as the PC party, had Alison Redford's name right on them, but they were promoting, different infrastructure work that they were doing. A lot of this stuff sort of creeps into the partisan, right? And I mean, that's like you say, a government that's trying to get reelected, a lot of this kind of promotional, glossy paper spending really creeps into the partisan.
Yeah, I did have a director of communications from government give me grief over this particular waste of the week. He claimed that, what am I wanting to do? Have ministers write on little whiteboards and stick them up on the podiums. But Paige, here's what you do. Just a nice podium with a nice little British Columbia logo, the government logo. Just stick with that. We don't need the subliminal messaging in order to decide whether or not this press conference information is important. So,
but here would be the downside of not having those podium signs. I remember during the last Ontario election when Kathleen Wynne was elected, there was I can't remember what the typo was, but there was a hilarious typo. And sometimes, especially during campaign time, or if there's a sort of hurried press conference, they can make typos, which are funny for those of us who are petty and into politics. We'd miss out on that.
That's a good point. Well, that is it for this episode of Tax Talk from the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Be sure to follow Paige on Twitter at Paige McPhee or me at Jordan Bateman. And if you're listening to this on iTunes, please subscribe, give us a good rating. And if you watch this on Facebook Live, please click like. And you can check out our website at taxpayer.com. Paige and I are going to touch base and figure out when we can do another one of these. We're hopeful we can get a regular kind of time slot so that people can start coming by and joining us on Tax Talk Live again on Facebook Live. So Paige, thanks for doing this. And everybody, thanks for listening.
Yeah, thanks for everyone who joined us. See you later.